So my presentation is sort of like jumps off from the point of education that Tom just talked about. This is taken from some interim findings of my dissertation, which focuses on how to increase a social media user's resistance to disinformation. And so as I was framing my problem and my question that I would pursue for my dissertation, I was mostly approaching the disinformation cycle or spectrum from what do we do to stop disinformation, what do we do at the source. And then I started looking at how it's distributed and the role that social media companies play, the role that users play. And then eventually I landed on the targets of disinformation. So how do you make a target hard to hit is the core question. How do you make a social media user or a NATO troop member or employees of your company resilient targets for disinformation? And so just to define the problem more succinctly, there are too many social media users believing false information. What contributes to this problem today that hasn't contributed in the past are the 24-hour news cycle and the actual structure of social media. These two things make false information and the spread of it much more rapid and the effects more serious. As you all know, the 24-hour news cycle demands information, and it's driven. It combines with profit motive and these niche news organizations and heavy competition between them in order to create enough news content that users will click on or use. In the process of that, a lot of these news organizations are favoring breaking news over investigative journalism, and so the quality of information is going down while the speed of information is moving up. And that speed of information can move up because of how social media is structured. Research shows that we're more willing to believe or listen to information that is from people we know, given that we trust that person. Perhaps we wouldn't trust our grandmother with coronavirus can be healed with some herbal blend. But other sources in our social circle are often more trustworthy to us than a news anchor or other things like that. And so a social network allows us to receive that information quickly and trust it quickly. In addition to that, there's a lot of other aspects of social media structure that allow for news to spread more quickly than how quickly bots can share disinformation. There's a study coming out of MIT that studied 11 years worth of tweets over 125,000 tweets. And they found that people spread false information faster than bots spread false information. And so just the social side of this problem was one that I wanted to target. And so I won't go into this, but there's a lot of data that we leave behind that can be used against us. And oftentimes we don't really understand that it can be a sort of a liability that we're leaving it behind. And so the proposed solution that I am looking at in this research is one that complements other approaches that have already been taken or are being taken to address the sources of disinformation and the distribution of disinformation. I focus on the targets of disinformation to add a target-centered approach to our countering disinformation strategy, where I propose using social science methods to harden a social media user or troops against disinformation attacks. The picture in the background is that of a aircraft shelter that's been hardened so that it's less susceptible to low-level or different types of attacks. And so my thought is, how can we make our social media users less susceptible to disinformation and approach this social problem with a lot of social science-based solutions? And so in the research I've done so far, looking at mostly psychology, sociology, health, and advertising literature, I found 3 techniques that I think are applicable and usable by for sure social media companies, but also the crowd here. And so those three are inoculation, and we actually got a great introduction to what that might look like with Julian and Emma at their high school. So inoculation techniques, public commitments, and media literacy. The points of these are to allow, for me in the dissertation, it's social media companies, and for you it's your organizations, to create interventions that make direct appeals to your users or to your employees or troops. Just like disinformation makes those direct appeals, I think it's a good idea to enter that space as well and create interventions that make direct appeals to your users. And so the first is inoculation. It's been studied since the 1960s. It's transferred across several social fields, including sociology, psychology, health communications, and marketing. What it is it's a person's existing attitude or belief can be strengthened against persuasive messaging when it's first immunized, using a weakened version of the persuasive message with counter-arguments or refutations. So that's a lot of text. I'm more visual in my learning style. So an inoculation is where you have a participant or a user who has agreed to be inoculated or knows that it's happening. And you give them a weakened version of an argument along with counter-arguments and refutations. And so it's been used in public health for trying to help people not smoke, or before they start smoking, help them to not start smoking. And so you might give them a weakened version of a smoking ad. They might say like Joe Cool or Joe Camel thinks it's cool to smoke, and you should think that too. And then a refutation might be it's not cool to smoke, and then a counter argument would be smoking leads to several health effects that are not desirable. And make those arguments persuasive. And then later when that same person is viewing the actual smoking ad with all the music and all the graphics that make it look really appealing to smoke, often those thoughts of the counter-arguments and the refutations can be brought back to mind, and in the research we've seen that there's quite an increased resistance to that persuasion through these inoculations. And so what about inoculations against disinformation? What research has been done on that? The first is a game for inoculation called Bad News. It's similar in effect to what we saw with the high school students. It's a fake news game where the player is made into a fake news baron. And in order to win the game, they have to use disinformation tactics in order to gain the most followers and the most people believing their false information. And so as they use these tactics, they learn them. And we saw that with our high school students, that they were using some of these disinformation tactics and then becoming savvy and hardened to those tactics. They're less susceptible to them. The initial evaluation of the paper, this game right now is online, you can go find it. But the earlier version, the paper pencil version, was shown that those who played the game relied on fake news much less. There's still some tentative evaluation of the online version of the game, but it looks promising. Second is there's a group of researchers in South Korea who were inoculating participants against corporate parody videos. There were several corporations that were spreading false information about other corporations, and so they inoculating these users using YouTube videos, and then expose them to the corporation's false information. And then they found out later through evaluation that these users resisted this false information much more. They distrusted the sources of the manipulation, and they were more able to identify when they were being manipulated. A few more examples from the research on how inoculation can help in fighting disinformation is that inoculation has a spillover effect, meaning that you don't have to inoculate against every piece of disinformation. That one inoculation can often produce inoculations for other pieces of different disinformation that the person might encounter. A hypothetical example might be if there's a smoking inoculation, that person might also think of those same counter-arguments when they see an ad for juuling or smoking other types of drugs. The second one is inoculations can spread virally. This is exciting to me, and leaves also like a need to use marketing in our inoculation messages. It's exciting because misinformation and disinformation often relies on that social network that we all form to spread, and we can use that same social network to spread messages that will help harden our users against disinformation. But it requires that the message is appealing, that it's shareable, that it resonates with that person or that audience. This is where I would point out that either employers or companies or social media companies who want to use inoculations need to know their audience very well and know them in an ethical way so that they're not committing the same types of processes that might be used in disinformation and then erode trust that that person might have in that company. Maintaining trust is really important to being able to make effective inoculations. The final bullet point is not exactly from inoculation research, but it is associated, closely related with it. It's that forewarning against persuasive intent rather than content can avoid backfire. Backfire meaning avoiding having the opposite of the intended effect. And so a lot of research showed that when somebody already had a belief that you were trying to dissuade them from or weaken their certainty in that belief, that whenever an inoculation message happened, that person or those users dug in their heels and they believed even more their belief. However, when instead the intent to persuade was inoculated against, there wasn't the same type of resistance to that persuasion. Those users that were warned of the intent of the ad coming at them to persuade them made them more wary of it, and they weren't persuaded as well by that information. And so staying out of the weeds of some of the items of disinformation and sticking with intent or tactics or other methods that might be used against them to persuade them to believe in disinformation not only enjoys spillover effects and helps spread inoculation to other pieces of disinformation, but it also makes it more likely that there won't be a backfire effect. So that is the first practical methodology that might be useful for companies or troops or social media companies to create more resistance to disinformation in their users. The second one is public commitments. It's pretty straightforward. Public commitments are a self-obligation to do something. People feel a strong obligation to fulfill public commitments in order to be seen as consistent. This is taken from influence literature that people want to be consistent, and so once they make a public commitment, they're much more likely to follow through with that. One clever example from research was signing for taxpayers who sign the top of a tax form saying that they will fill it out to the best of their ability and as accurately as possible, and then filled out their taxes, usually paid a more accurate tax than those who signed it at the end. And so making that public commitment at the beginning helped obligate themselves to filling it out as accurately as possible, to doing whatever it was that they signed up to do. And so that's an example of a public commitment. Other examples include signing a petition, a survey choice can be a public commitment, a social media post. We'll talk about a few more applications a little bit later. And the last method or technique is media literacy. Media literacy are programs that train people to discern false information from true by teaching them how to access and critically evaluate that information. We're all fairly familiar with media literacy programs. The only downside is that there are very few evaluations of these programs. So it's very difficult to know how well they work, if they work, what needs to be improved to make them work better. However, there is one really good example of an evaluation I found through Ukraine's Learn to Discern project. A little over a year after they had a group complete their media literacy program, they evaluated their participants and they matched them in age, region, education, and gender to their cohort, and found that 28% were more likely to demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of news media industry. The next bullet point I thought was even more interesting, that 25% of these participants were more likely to self-report checking multiple news sources. And I feel if there were reason, if there were at least 25% more people online who were double checking their news, there'd be less news shared, less false information shared, and the overall level would start to decrease, and we'd see more hardened, more sophisticated, more capable social media users able to discern disinformation. And so some quick ideas for application are that annual and pre-deployment internet security trainings might include inoculations against disinformation tactics, against disinformation intent, and also any current narratives from adversaries that might be specifically targeting those troops or those or that group of people. During deployment, you might be able to measure attitude certainty of troops and give booster shots or additional trainings. And also, we could have service members sign the beginning of a training saying they will pay attention, and then committing at the end to be watchful of false information, incorporating that public commitment component. And finally, funding evaluations of media literacy programs, I think would be able to help us hone our abilities to help users better discern information, and then be able to spread that hopefully in viral ways through the existing social graph that we have on social media. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary. Just a quick question. During your research, did you come across any methods that are proposed or tested that sort of persuade people who already hold a certain belief? So inoculation works for people who don't hold a certain belief, but are there any methods in social sciences that kind of achieve the effect of persuading someone back?
Yeah, so the short answer is it's very difficult to persuade someone back from something they already hold, and a good metric to look at before you try is the level of their certainty. And so if they're very certain, it's better to attack it from another angle, like look at the tactics or do something on the periphery. If they are more ambivalent or they don't care as much, they're much more easily persuaded. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.